I found my husband's practice wife locked in our basement with our wedding photos on the walls. The sound came through the air vent at 3:47 a.m., faint enough that I thought I was dreaming. A woman's voice singing a lullaby I recognized from my own childhood. My eyes opened in the darkness of our bedroom while Thomas slept beside me with his hand resting on my pregnant belly. The singing stopped abruptly like someone had pressed mute on a television. I lay there listening to my husband's steady breathing and wondering if exhaustion from the third trimester was making me hear things that weren't real. The house was silent except for the usual sounds of settling wood and the furnace clicking on in the November cold. I waited another 10 minutes before sliding out of bed and walking to the heating vent near our closet door. The metal grate felt cold against my palm as I pressed my ear close and held my breath to listen. Nothing. Just the hollow sound of air moving through ducts. Thomas stirred behind me and mumbled something about coming back to bed. I told him I needed water and he rolled over without opening his eyes. Downstairs in the kitchen, I filled a glass at the sink while staring at my reflection in the dark window. 7 months pregnant with shadows under my eyes and wearing one of Thomas's old college shirts that barely stretched over my stomach anymore. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway past the laundry room. We'd only been in the house for 4 months since Thomas got promoted to regional director at his firm. He'd insisted on this specific property even though it needed work, and the basement had flooded twice before we bought it. The realtor kept steering us toward newer construction. But Thomas loved the history of old homes and the potential he saw in the unfinished spaces he'd been working on the basement since we moved in, installing new drywall and updating the electrical system himself on weekends. He told me to stay upstairs because of the dust and exposed wiring that could be dangerous for the baby. I stood at the top of the basement stairs with my hand on the doorknob. The door was locked with a deadbolt that Thomas had installed a month ago. When I asked why we needed to lock an interior door, he explained that the construction materials and power tools down there were expensive and we should secure them until the renovation was complete. It made sense at the time. Now at 4 a.m., with that lullaby still echoing in my memory, the locked door felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I tried the knob anyway, knowing it wouldn't turn. The metal was cold and unyielding. Back in bed, I couldn't sleep. Thomas's breathing was deep and rhythmic beside me while my mind spun through possibilities. The house was old, and sounds traveled strangely through the ductwork. I'd heard the neighbors' television through the vents before, and their garage door opening sounded like it was in our attic. The singing could have come from the house next door where the Kellermans lived with their 3 young daughters. Except I knew that lullaby word for word because my grandmother sang it to me every night for years, and it was in Polish. The Kellermans were from Texas and didn't speak anything but English. Morning came with Thomas kissing my forehead before he left for work. He smelled like the expensive cologne I'd bought him for his birthday, and his suit was perfectly pressed. He told me he had client meetings all day and would be home late, probably after 8 o'clock. He asked if I needed anything before he left, and I almost mentioned the singing. But his eyes were already distant and focused on whatever presentation he'd be giving, and I didn't want him to think pregnancy hormones were making me irrational. He touched my belly one more time, and then he was gone. I spent the morning organizing the nursery and folding impossibly small clothing into dresser drawers. My best friend Vanessa called around 10 to check on me, and I told her about the singing I'd heard. She laughed and said her sister had heard full conversations through the vents when she was pregnant, complete hallucinations brought on by sleep deprivation and anxiety. Vanessa reminded me that I'd been having trouble sleeping for weeks, and my doctor had mentioned that exhaustion could cause auditory distortions. It felt good to have a rational explanation. I thanked her and we made plans for lunch next week. But at 2 p.m. when I was putting away laundry near the hallway vent, I heard it again. Not singing this time. Crying. Soft and muffled, but unmistakably human and unmistakably coming from below me, I dropped the towels I was holding and pressed my face against the vent cover. The crying continued for maybe 30 seconds before stopping just as suddenly as the singing had. My heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel my pulse in my throat. I grabbed my phone and called Thomas. His assistant answered and said he was in meetings until 5 o'clock. I left a message asking him to call me back as soon as possible. Emergency. The spare key to the basement door should have been in the kitchen junk drawer, where we kept all the random keys from previous locks and the shed and the mailbox. I dumped the entire drawer onto the counter and sorted through 15 different keys while my hands shook. None of them fit the basement deadbolt. I tried every single key we owned, including the ones for Thomas's office and his gym locker and the safe deposit box at the bank. Nothing worked. The door stayed locked and whatever was making those sounds remained hidden behind it. Thomas called back at 3:30 and his voice had that edge of impatience he got when work was stressful. He asked what was wrong and I told him about the sounds from the basement. He was quiet for a long moment before explaining that he'd scheduled contractors to work on the HVAC system that week, and they might have left a radio playing or their equipment running. The sound was probably echoing through the ductwork in ways that seemed like it was coming from our basement when it was actually from next door or the street. His explanation was smooth and reasonable. I wanted to believe it. He promised to check the basement when he got home and to call the contractors about any noise issues. But something about his tone felt rehearsed, like he'd been preparing that explanation before I even called. I stood in the kitchen, with the phone still in my hand, after we hung up, and realized I'd never actually seen these contractors. He mentioned, never heard them working or seen their trucks outside. Thomas had been very specific about me staying upstairs when anyone was working in the basement. He said the liability insurance didn't cover me being in the construction zone while pregnant. It had seemed protective and caring. Now it felt like something else entirely. I went to our home office and opened Thomas's laptop without thinking about whether I should. We'd always had each other's passwords and complete access to accounts and devices. Trust was fundamental to our marriage, he'd said many times. The laptop opened to his email and I searched for any correspondence with contractors or HVC companies. Nothing. I searched for basement, renovation, construction, still nothing. His inbox was meticulously organized with folders for work projects and personal matters and household expenses. But there were no emails about any work being done on our house, except the initial home inspection from when we bought the property. The calendar application showed his schedule for the week with color-coded blocks for meetings and client calls and gym sessions. But every Tuesday and Thursday evening from 7 to 9 p.m., there were blank spaces marked only as Home Project in dark red. I clicked on one of the entries and it expanded to show a detailed description I hadn't seen in the monthly view. Maintenance required. Do not disturb, keep upstairs. The entries went back months to before we even moved into the house. Every single week without exception. My phone rang and I nearly dropped it. Vanessa calling back. She asked if I was feeling better after our morning conversation and I told her I was fine, which was a lie she could tell. Her voice got serious and concerned when she said I sounded scared. I explained about not being able to find any evidence of contractors and about Thomas's strange blocked-off time in his calendar. Vanessa was quiet and then suggested maybe I should call the police if I genuinely believed someone was in our basement. The suggestion seemed extreme and I immediately pushed back call the police on my own husband because I heard crying that could have been anything. But even as I said it, I knew it sounded like I was making excuses. After we hung up, I walked back to the basement door. The deadbolt was solid and professional grade, not the cheap hardware store type. I took a photo of it with my phone and did a reverse image search. The results showed commercial security locks used for gun safes and vault doors. The product description mentioned tamper-resistant design and pick-proof cylinder. This wasn't a lock to keep out casual thieves. This was a lock to contain something. The realization made my stomach turn. I sat on the floor in the hallway with my back against the wall and tried to think of innocent explanations. Maybe Thomas was being extra cautious because of his expensive tools. Maybe he was worried about me accidentally hurting myself on the stairs in my pregnant state. None of it felt true. I texted Thomas asking when he'd be home. The response came back immediately. Running late. 9:30 probably. Sorry, love. I looked at the clock 5 hours. I went to the kitchen and found the toolbox under the sink. The screwdriver felt heavy in my hand as I carried it back to the basement door. I'd watched enough home improvement shows to know that door hinges could be removed from the outside even when the door was locked. The hinge pins looked standard. I positioned the screwdriver under the first pin and tapped it with a hammer. The pin moved slightly. I hit it again harder and it slid up enough to grip with my fingers. The first hinge came off after 10 minutes of work. The second took longer because my hands were sweating and I kept dropping the hammer. The third hinge had been painted over and required scraping before I could access the pin. By the time all 3 hinges were loose, my arms ached and I was breathing hard. The door still wouldn't budge because the deadbolt was holding it closed on the latch side, but there was enough flex now that I could see a sliver of space between the door and the frame. I pushed against the door with my shoulder, using my weight, and heard wood cracking. One more hard shove, and the frame splintered enough that the door swung inward with the deadbolt still extended into empty air. The basement stairs descended into darkness. The light switch at the top didn't work when I flipped it. I used my phone's flashlight and started down the steps slowly, one hand on the railing and the other holding the phone. The air smelled wrong. Not musty like an old basement, but clean, almost sterile, with an underlying scent of lavender air freshener. At the bottom of the stairs, I swept the phone light across the space, and my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The basement wasn't under construction. It was finished. Completely finished with painted walls and carpet and furniture. And there was a woman sitting on a bed in the corner watching me. She looked about my age with dark hair and hollow eyes. She was wearing pajamas, pink with little flowers. Her feet were bare. Around her left ankle was a metal cuff attached to a chain that bolted to the wall. She didn't move when my light hit her face. She just stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not quite relief, not quite fear. Something resigned and exhausted that made me feel sick. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. The woman spoke first. Her voice was hoarse like she hadn't used it in a long time. "You're Julia." It wasn't a question. She said my name like she'd been expecting me. I managed to whisper yes and asked who she was. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Melissa, Thomas's first wife." The words didn't make sense. Thomas had never been married before. He'd told me on our second date that I was his first serious relationship, that he'd focused on his career through his 20s and waited to find the right person before settling down. Melissa saw the confusion on my face and her smile got sadder. "He told you he wasn't married before." He told me the same thing. "There was a girl before me too, Rebecca. She's the one who figured it out first, but by then it was too late for her." I was shaking my head because this couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of breakdown or hallucination. Pregnant women had psychological episodes sometimes. Vanessa's sister had one. But Melissa kept talking in that flat, dead voice. Check the walls behind you. He kept everything. Every photo, every moment. He's very sentimental about his marriages. I turned around and the phone light showed what I'd missed when I came down the stairs. The entire wall was covered with photographs. Wedding photos, but not my wedding. These showed a younger Thomas with the woman sitting on the bed, Melissa in a white dress and Thomas in a tuxedo standing in front of a church I didn't recognize their first dance, cutting a cake, kissing under an archway of flowers. Hundreds of photos documenting a wedding that had supposedly never happened. I moved closer and saw dates written in the margins. 5 years ago. The photos were 5 years old. Next to Melissa's wedding wall was another section covered in photos of a different woman. This one had blonde hair and green eyes, and she was also standing beside Thomas in wedding clothes. The dates on these photos went back 8 years. Rebecca. More photos showed Rebecca and Thomas on a honeymoon beach and moving into a house and celebrating Christmas together. Below Rebecca's section was space for more photos. Fresh space with new frames already mounted. Empty frames waiting to be filled with pictures of me and Thomas at our wedding last summer. The pattern was obvious and horrifying. I turned back to Melissa. How long have you been down here? She looked at the ceiling like she was calculating. 3 years, maybe? It's hard to keep track. He took my phone and my watch. 3 years, chained in a basement. I was going to be sick. I asked where the bathroom was, and she pointed to a door in the corner. Inside was a small bathroom with a toilet and sink and shower. Everything clean and functional. I vomited into the toilet while my mind tried to process what was happening. My husband had a woman imprisoned in our basement. My husband who kissed me goodbye every morning and talked about baby names and made me breakfast in bed on Sundays. When I came out of the bathroom, Melissa was standing up. The chain attached to her ankle was long enough to reach most of the basement, but not the stairs. She walked over to a dresser and opened the top drawer. Inside were notebooks. Dozens of spiral notebooks with dates written on the covers. She pulled one out and handed it to me. Start with this one. It explains everything. The notebook was filled with cramped handwriting documenting days and months and years of captivity. I flipped through pages describing Thomas's visits and his rules and his punishments. The meticulous record of psychological torture. The entry from 3 months ago made me stop breathing. Thomas told me today he's getting married again. He showed me photos of her. Julia. She's pretty and she looks kind and I want to warn her, but he says if I make any sound when she's in the house, he'll stop bringing me food for a week. He says Julia is going to give him what I couldn't. A baby. He's been planning it for 18 months. He studied her routine at the coffee shop where she works and engineered their first meeting to seem accidental. None of it was chance. He chose her like he chose me, like he chose Rebecca. I dropped the notebook. 18 months of planning. Our entire relationship had been a performance. Every conversation, every date, every moment I thought we were falling in love had been Thomas executing a predetermined strategy. I was a target. A mark. Selected and groomed and trapped just like the women before me. The baby moving inside me wasn't a blessing. It was part of his plan. I asked Melissa what happened when he got tired of her. Why was she still down here if he'd moved on to me? Melissa's face showed something that might have been pity. He never gets tired of us. He just adds more. Rebecca is still here too. She pointed to another door I hadn't noticed in the far corner of the basement, a second door, with another commercial-grade lock. He built separate rooms for each of us. Rebecca's been here 8 years. She was pregnant when he brought her down. She had the baby in that room. Thomas took the child when it was born and told her it died. But she can hear crying sometimes through the vents like you did. The baby's real. He has someone raising it somewhere else. He told me he's going to do the same with yours. The room spun. I grabbed the dresser to stay upright. My baby. He was going to take my baby. I asked why Melissa hadn't tried to escape when she heard me breaking in. She lifted her foot and showed me the ankle cuff. It has a sensor. If I tamper with it or if it gets more than 50 feet from the basement, it triggers an alarm that calls his phone. He installed the system himself. He's very thorough. She sat back down on the bed and her voice got even quieter. You should leave right now before he comes home. Take your car and drive to a police station and tell them everything. Show them the photos. They'll come back with you and find us. That's the only way this works. And I was already moving toward the stairs when I heard the garage door opening above us. Thomas was home. 3 hours early. The sound of his footsteps crossed the kitchen floor directly overhead. Melissa's face went white. He knows you're down here. The door. He has a notification system for if the door is breached. I ran for the stairs, but Thomas appeared at the top before I could reach them. He looked down at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the warm, loving face of my husband. Something cold and calculating that made me understand I'd never actually known him at all. He came down the stairs slowly while reaching into his pocket. Julia, I wish you hadn't done this. We had such a nice plan. Everything was going so well. His voice was calm and conversational, like we were discussing weekend plans. I backed away until I hit the wall. Thomas pulled out a syringe from his pocket and smiled apologetically. This won't hurt the baby. I promise it's just something to help you sleep while I figure out how to handle this situation. You're not supposed to know about them yet. Not until after the baby comes, but we can adjust the timeline. I threw my phone at his face as hard as I could. It hit his cheek and he stumbled backward with a grunt of pain. I ran past him toward the stairs, but he grabbed my arm and yanked me back. We struggled and I screamed as loud as possible, hoping someone would hear. Thomas's hand clamped over my mouth. Shh! Stop fighting. You're going to hurt the baby. His other hand moved toward me. With the syringe, I bit down on his palm hard enough to taste blood. He yelled and dropped the syringe, and it shattered on the concrete floor. Thomas's face changed. The calm mask dropped completely. He punched me in the stomach. Not hard enough to seriously injure, but enough that I doubled over, gasping for air. He shoved me toward Melissa's corner of the basement. Stay there, both of you. I need to think. He was pacing now and his hands were shaking. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. You ruined the schedule. Everything was perfect and you ruined it. Melissa caught me before I fell and helped me sit on the bed. She whispered very quietly in my ear. The phone. Did you drop it upstairs or down here? I couldn't remember. Everything had happened so fast. Thomas was still pacing and muttering to himself about contingency plans and damage control. I scanned the floor and saw my phone near the bottom of the stairs where it had fallen after I threw it. The screen was cracked, but the light was still on. Thomas hadn't noticed it yet. If I could get to it, if I could call for help. Melissa saw where I was looking and understood. She stood up suddenly and started screaming at Thomas. You bastard! You said you loved me. You said we were going to have a family. You lied about everything. Thomas turned toward her with irritation in his voice. Not now, Melissa. I'm busy. But she kept screaming and crying and saying things designed to keep his attention on her. She was giving me an opening. I slid off the bed and crawled toward the stairs while Thomas argued with Melissa. My hand closed around the phone just as Thomas looked down and saw what I was doing. He lunged toward me, but Melissa grabbed the chain attached to her ankle and swung it at him. The metal links hit him across the back of his head and he went down hard. I ran up the stairs with my phone clutched against my chest. Behind me, I could hear Thomas groaning and Melissa yelling for me to run. I made it to the kitchen and locked the basement door behind me, pushing the refrigerator in front of it with strength I didn't know I had. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my phone. I dialed 911, and a woman's voice answered asking about my emergency. I was crying so hard I could barely speak, but I managed to tell her my address and that my husband had women imprisoned in our basement. The operator stayed on the line with me while I ran to the front door and out onto the lawn. Neighbors were starting to come outside because of my screaming. Mrs. Kellerman from next door ran over in her bathrobe asking what was wrong. I couldn't form words. I just pointed at the house and kept saying, basement, over and over. Police cars arrived within 6 minutes. 4 officers with weapons drawn approached the house while one stayed with me asking questions I couldn't answer coherently. They went inside and I heard shouting and then silence, and then one of the officers came back out and said they needed an ambulance. Multiple ambulances. They brought out Melissa first on a stretcher. The paramedics had removed the ankle cuff and she was holding an oxygen mask to her face. Our eyes met as they loaded her into the ambulance and she nodded at me. Just a small nod of acknowledgement. Then they brought out Rebecca. She looked worse than Melissa, thinner and weaker and barely conscious. She had to be carried because her legs couldn't support her weight after 8 years of limited movement. The third stretcher confused me until I realized it was Thomas. He was awake and handcuffed and screaming about his rights and unlawful search. A female detective named Kowalski sat with me in the ambulance while a paramedic checked my blood pressure and the baby's heartbeat. She asked if I felt safe enough to answer some questions and I said yes. She wanted to know how long I'd lived in the house and when I'd discovered the women in the basement. I told her about the singing and the crying and breaking down the door. She wrote everything in a notebook with a steady hand. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading. Did I know about the women before today? I saw the suspicion in her eyes. How could a wife not know her husband kept prisoners in the basement? I told her the truth. I had no idea. We'd only been married 7 months and in the house for 4. Thomas always made me stay upstairs when he worked in the basement. She asked if I noticed anything strange about his behavior. Any red flags? I thought about all the moments that seemed sweet at the time. How protective he was. How involved he was in planning my schedule. How he always knew where I was. The careful monitoring I'd interpreted as love. She could see the realization on my face. It's not your fault, she said. Men like him are very good at hiding what they are. They took me to the hospital for observation even though I insisted I was fine. The baby was fine. They needed to monitor us both after the physical altercation. Thomas had been arrested at the scene and charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and assault. The detective said there would be more charges once they finished processing the evidence. I spent the night in a hospital bed with a police officer stationed outside my door for protection. Vanessa came as soon as visiting hours started and held my hand while I told her everything. She cried. I couldn't. I felt numb and hollowed out. The news coverage started that afternoon. I watched from my hospital bed as reporters stood in front of our house describing the house of horrors and the suburban nightmare. They showed photos of Thomas from his company website alongside his mugshot. The contrast was striking. The polished executive versus the monster. His defense attorney gave a statement claiming Thomas suffered from mental illness and deserved compassion. I threw the remote at the television and a nurse came running. Rebecca and Melissa were in the same hospital getting treatment for malnutrition and psychological trauma. The hospital social worker asked if I wanted to see them, and I said yes. They brought me to Rebecca's room first. She was awake and propped up with pillows. She looked at me for a long time before speaking. He told me you were dead. When he moved on to Melissa, he said I'd killed you by not cooperating with his plans. I believed him for 5 years. Her voice cracked. I'm sorry, I should have found a way to warn you. I sat in the chair beside her bed. She told me about her son, 7 years old now. Thomas had taken him when he was 3 days old. She'd spent 8 years believing her baby was dead until she heard crying through the vents 6 months ago. The police were trying to locate the child, but Thomas refused to give information about where he'd placed him. Rebecca's hands shook when she talked about it. He's out there somewhere and he doesn't know me and he thinks I abandoned him. The cruelty of it made me physically ill. Thomas had weaponized her own child against her. Melissa's room was down the hall. She looked stronger than Rebecca despite her more recent captivity. She explained that she'd been a nutritionist before Thomas took her, so she'd managed to maintain her health better by rationing the food he brought and doing exercises in the limited space. She'd also documented everything in those notebooks I'd seen. Every interaction, every detail, every pattern. I knew eventually someone would find us. I wanted to make sure there was evidence he couldn't deny. The notebooks became the prosecution's primary evidence. Melissa had documented Thomas's patterns meticulously. How he selected women who were isolated with few close friends or family, how he monitored their routines for months before approaching them. The elaborate courtships designed to create dependency. His control tactics and manipulation strategies. She'd written down every word he'd said during his visits, including his explanations of why he did this. He said marriage was a performance and wives were props in his perfect life. He needed us to look right, to say the right things, to produce children on schedule. When we failed to meet his standards, he replaced us but kept us as backups in case the new wife didn't work out. I asked what happened to the women before Rebecca. Melissa's face got dark. There were at least 2 others. Thomas talked about them sometimes, Sarah and Christina. He said they were released from service when they became too much trouble. I don't think they survived. The police are searching properties Thomas owned in other states looking for remains. The scope of his crimes kept expanding. This wasn't just false imprisonment. This was serial killing spread over a decade or more. The DNA testing came back 2 weeks later. Rebecca's son had been located in a foster home 3 states away. Thomas had abandoned him at a fire station when the child was 6 months old. The boy had been adopted by a family who had no idea about his real mother. Rebecca fought for custody and won. I watched from the courthouse gallery as she held her son for the first time in 7 years. The boy was confused and scared. He didn't remember her, but Rebecca didn't care. She held him and cried and promised she would never let anyone take him again. Thomas's trial started 4 months after my discovery. I was 8 months pregnant by then, huge and uncomfortable and terrified of giving birth to a monster's child. The prosecution called me to testify first. I walked to the stand with my swollen belly leading the way and refused to look at Thomas sitting at the defense table. The prosecutor asked me to describe what I'd found in the basement. I told the jury everything in detail. The photos on the walls, the chains and locks, Melissa sitting on that bed with dead eyes, Rebecca wasting away in a separate room, the baby that had been stolen. Thomas's lawyer tried to discredit me during cross-examination. He suggested I'd known about the women all along and only reported them when I wanted out of the marriage. He implied I was an accomplice. The judge sustained most of the prosecution's objections, but some of the accusations stuck with the jury. I could see doubt in their faces. The prosecutor repaired the damage during redirect by having me read excerpts from Melissa's notebooks that proved I had no knowledge of Thomas's crimes, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. Rebecca testified next, and the courtroom went silent as she described 8 years in that basement room. The jury looked horrified. One woman was openly crying. Rebecca's voice stayed steady as she talked about giving birth alone and having her baby torn away, about the chains and the isolation and Thomas's visits, where he would describe his new perfect life with Melissa and later with me. The defense attorney barely questioned her. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't make things worse for Thomas. Melissa took the stand on the 3rd day. She brought the notebooks with her. The prosecutor entered all 47 of them into evidence. Melissa read selected passages that detailed Thomas's psychology and his methods. She explained how he'd chosen each of them carefully, how he'd researched their backgrounds and identified their vulnerabilities. Sarah had been recently divorced. Christina had lost her parents in a car accident. Rebecca had dropped out of medical school due to financial problems. Melissa had been laid off from her job. I had been working at a coffee shop with no family nearby and student loan debt. We were all isolated and struggling easy targets. The defense's strategy fell apart on day 5 when Thomas decided to testify against his lawyer's advice. He took the stand and confidently explained that he'd done nothing wrong. In his mind, he'd provided for these women, given them homes and security. He'd been a good husband to all of us. The fact that we were locked in a basement was for our own protection. We were unstable and couldn't be trusted in the real world. He'd been taking care of us? The jury stared at him with undisguised disgust. His lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear. Thomas kept talking, explaining his philosophy of marriage and control and why women needed strong men to manage them. He dug his own grave with every word. The verdict came back after 3 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Multiple charges of kidnapping, false imprisonment, assault, and child endangerment. The judge sentenced him to 45 years without possibility of parole. Thomas's face showed shock, like he genuinely couldn't understand why he was being punished for what he viewed as proper behavior. He looked at me in the gallery and said my name. I turned away. That part of my life was over. I gave birth 2 weeks after the sentencing. A daughter. 7 pounds 4 ounces with Thomas's dark hair and my eyes. The nurses asked what I wanted to name her, and I chose my grandmother's name, Sophia. No connection to him. Vanessa stayed with me during labor and held my hand through every contraction. Rebecca and Melissa visited the next day bringing flowers and a stuffed animal. We took a photo together, 4 women who'd survived the same monster, holding the baby who would never know her father. The civil suits took another year to resolve. Thomas's assets were liquidated and divided between Rebecca, Melissa, and me. The house was sold and demolished. None of us could stand the thought of it still existing. The money gave us all a fresh start. Rebecca used hers to build a life with her son. Melissa went back to school for a degree in psychology, focusing on trauma recovery. I bought a small house in a different state where nobody knew my story. Sophia is 3 now. She asks questions about her father sometimes, and I tell her the truth in age-appropriate ways. I explain that some people make very bad choices, and her father made choices that hurt people. She doesn't need to know the details yet. Maybe when she's older, maybe never. I see a therapist twice a week, and I've joined a support group for survivors of domestic violence. The nightmares are less frequent. I can sleep through most nights now without waking up, convinced I hear crying through the vents. Rebecca's son is 10 and adjusted remarkably well. He calls Rebecca mom now, and they've built a relationship despite the lost years. Melissa opened a practice specializing in helping other survivors. We talk every few weeks and meet for coffee when we can. We formed a bond none of us expected, connected by shared trauma, but also by shared strength. We survived something that should have destroyed us, and we came out whole on the other side. Thomas writes letters from prison that I never open. They pile up in a box in my closet marked evidence in case I ever need proof of continued harassment. His mother reached out once asking to meet Sophia, and I declined through my lawyer. There is no relationship there, no forgiveness. He took 3 years from Melissa, 8 years from Rebecca, and almost took everything from me. The only justice is his cage, and even that feels insufficient for what he did. But it's what we have, and sometimes survival is its own form of victory. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.